You know, adapting a beloved book for the silver screen is absolutely always a monumental task. But when we're talking about taking Andy Weir's highly scientific, incredibly intricate novel, Project Hail Mary, and putting it on film, well, the stakes feel pretty astronomical. Directed by the brilliant duo Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, and penned by Drew Goddard, this adaptation had an enormous mountain to climb. They had to figure out how to translate heavy math, intense isolation, and really complex extraterrestrial communication into a massive visual spectacle. So, in this explainer, we are breaking down exactly how they pulled this off, where they decided to pivot, and how the final product actually holds up against the source material. Let's dive in. At its core, it's the ultimate odd couple in space. Our story follows Ryland Grace, played by Ryan Gosling, who is this overqualified, incredibly smart, yet totally quirky middle school biology teacher. He wakes up with amnesia on a spaceship and eventually realizes he's on a desperate last-ditch mission to figure out why Earth's sun is dying. But, as you'll see, he's not entirely alone out there in the cosmos. He ends up meeting an extraterrestrial, a little rock-like alien he cleverly names Rocky, who's actually on the exact same mission to save his own dying star. So you've got these two lonely beings from completely different worlds teaming up to save their respective solar systems. It's a fantastic premise. But before we really start analyzing the cinematic choices here, we have to talk about a very specific lens through which a lot of fans are going to view this film. It's something we call the burden of knowledge. See, when you've already read the book, your brain is just packed with the internal logic, the extended troubleshooting, and the deep lore that a 2-hour film literally cannot fit in. It creates this constant tension between the mind of the reader and the eye of the viewer. You find yourself watching the screen and thinking, wait a minute, I feel like I'm missing something here. It's part of the magic of books, but it creates a really unique challenge when you try to just judge the film entirely on its own merits. So, to understand exactly how this adaptation handles that burden, here is our roadmap for today. First, escaping the CGI cesspool. Second, translating the inner mind. Third, the pacing paradox. And finally, 2 mediums, 1 message. All right, let's jump right into part 1, escaping the CGI cesspool. In today's cinematic landscape, honestly, we are just incredibly used to modern blockbusters feeling like an overly inflated, cartoonish CGI mess, right? It feels like one movie just blends right into the next. But Lord and Miller made a deliberate and really fascinating choice with Project Hail Mary. They leaned heavily into tactile realism. Instead of just throwing Ryan Gosling into a completely green box, they utilized practical sets built to actual scale. And even more incredibly, the alien, Rocky, is largely an actual animatronic puppet. That gives Gosling a real physical presence to interact with on set. They also used massive immersive LED screens that wrap around the stage instead of traditional green screens. This provides genuine, dynamic lighting and creates a wonderfully grounded, authentic environment. And a massive chunk of this grounded realism comes directly down to the cinematographer, Greg Fraser. We're talking about the absolute legend behind the camera for Dune and The Batman. Fraser completely rejects that flat, uniformly bright lighting that makes some modern big-budget movies look kind of like a basic YouTube video. Instead, he embraces a classic, deeply dramatic cinematic look. If you pay attention, you'll notice these stark, heavy shadows on the characters' faces. The backgrounds of the ship are noticeably darker than the subject, which perfectly mimics the harsh, unyielding nature of deep space. Now, these might sound like minor details, but they add up. They give the film a massive sense of weight and reality. It's a genuine celebration of true cinema over easy digital shortcuts. Moving right along to part 2, translating the inner mind. So in the book, we spend a ton of time literally inside Ryland Grace's head. He wakes up with amnesia, right? He feels that gravity is acting kind of strange. And because he is a scientist to his core, what does he do? He begins dropping objects. He observes their fall, and he performs some seriously complex math right there in his head to deduce the exact gravitational pull. He calculates standard gravity at around 9.8 meters per second squared, and it's exactly through that precise math that he realizes, oh, I am not on Earth, I'm on a centrifuge spaceship. The book totally thrives on this first-hand troubleshooting. You, as the reader, are solving the puzzle right alongside him, piece by painstaking piece. But here is how the movie handles that exact same sequence. It's totally fast-tracked. He wakes up, he climbs a ladder, he looks out a window, and boom, he knows he's on a spaceship. It is an immediate visual shorthand. The film completely bypasses all of that mathematical, deductive reasoning just to keep the visual story moving at a really brisk pace. And this brings us right back to that burden of knowledge we talked about earlier. The difference between these two experiences is absolutely profound. For the reader, that methodical puzzle solving creates massive emotional punches. When Grace finally figures something out after agonizing over the science for pages, the reveal feels huge. You earned it. But for the viewer of the film, a lot of this information is simply skimmed over using quick voiceovers or those fast-tracked visual shortcuts. Sure, you get the necessary information to understand the plot, but it sometimes lacks that deep, earned emotional punch that the raw thought process provided in the source material. It's definitely an objective choice by the filmmakers to prioritize visual storytelling, but man, it drastically changes the audience's emotional journey. However, there is one major exception to this fast-tracking rule, and honestly, it is a phenomenal narrative choice. The filmmakers deliberately chose to slow down and really linger on the language barrier between Ryland and Rocky. They treat the translation process almost like that classic Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Darmok. They don't just magically hand them a universal translator to speed things up. No way. They make the characters work for it. They show the painstaking but totally beautiful process of learning to communicate with an alien species, using tonal chords and physical models. It's a sequence that demands your full attention, and the filmmakers brilliantly give it the breathing room it truly deserves. Which brings us to part 3, the pacing paradox. Now, to put things into perspective, the runtime for this film adaptation sits at an incredibly hefty 2 hours and 40 minutes. Think about that for a second. That puts Project Hail Mary in the exact same heavyweight class as The Dark Knight. That is a massive chunk of time to spend essentially locked in one single spaceship setting. So this leads us to a completely paradoxical question. How on earth can a movie of this length actually feel slightly too long, while simultaneously making viewers who know the story feel like it desperately needs a 3-hour extended cut? Well, let's break down exactly why this happens. Because the film fast-tracks Grace's deep scientific thoughts, it actually skips over some absolutely crucial character building. And the result? Certain emotional beats just feel a bit unearned. But at the exact same time, because the film occasionally decides to linger on minor moments longer than it probably needs to, it disrupts the natural narrative flow. That's what makes a 2-hour and 40-minute runtime feel like it's dragging in certain spots. So you end up with a movie that occasionally feels a bit slow, but because of all that missing troubleshooting and the slight gaps in logic left behind, you actually find yourself wanting more movie. You literally want a 3-hour cut just to properly flesh out the thought processes so everything feels earned. It's an absolutely fascinating paradox of film editing versus book pacing. And finally, part 4, 2 mediums, 1 message. So where does this leave us? Despite the burden of knowledge and despite missing a lot of that intense math, the final verdict here is that the film brilliantly captures the true spirit of the source material. The universal themes survive the transition totally intact. That core odd couple and space dynamic is fantastic, largely thanks to Ryan Gosling just oozing charisma in the role. The deep, heartfelt friendship between Rylance and Rocky works incredibly well on screen. The overarching theme of a common man stepping up to do what is best for others shines through so brightly. And perhaps most importantly, the humor. Thanks specifically to Lord and Miller's distinct directorial style, the film is arguably even funnier than the book. They play up the visual laughs and the phrasing perfectly, without ever betraying the tone of the original world. Ultimately, books and movies just operate on completely different frequencies. One lets you literally live inside a character's brain, while the other invites you to watch them from the outside. So the question I want to leave you with today is this. How do you balance your expectations when your absolute favorite books finally hit the silver screen? Are you able to separate the two mediums, or does the burden of knowledge always hitch a ride to the theater with you? Think about that the next time you grab your popcorn. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.